人數已夠啦，我哋可以開始今日呢個
We have a quorum, so let's make a start. This is a subcommittee on building standards of sanitary fitments. Any nomination for chairmanship? Ms. Alice Mack. All right. Anyone seconds? Mr. Ma. Do you accept? Yes. Any other nomination? No? All right. So my work is complete. So I'll give way to the lady here to chair the meeting. Please be fair to men.
Okay. Okay. 我想問大家有冇
Do we need to elect a deputy chairman? No. So thank you for your support. So let's call to order this meeting, and I'll invite the administration in first.
Okay. 好。Okay.
呢一個可以延長㗎。
Okay. 好。
我哋有房嘅。
好。
你睇下先。
Okay. 唔該晒。咁咧，我首先就。
So I will first invite the administration to walk us through the paper, which is about building standards of sanitary fitness, plumbing, drainage works, and Latrines Amendment Regulation 2015 and Building Administration Amendment Number 2 Regulation 2015. The list of attendance has been tabled. I will read it out. So, Mr. Liu, Deputy Secretary, over to you. Thank you, Chairman. Now, the purpose of the amendment regulations is to update the standards of sanitary fitments in private buildings. Well, the amendment regulations, the regulation was first enacted in 1959. The principal regulations govern the standards for the provision of sanitary fitments as well as planning, design, and construction of plumbing, drainage, and wells in private buildings. Now, the legislation has been enacted for some time, and the Buildings Department earlier on reviewed the regulation and also engaged a consultant in conducting a study. And in light of the review findings, we believe that there is a need to overhaul the principal regulations. And there is also a public aspiration for more sanitary facilities for female. So we've decided to adopt a two-stage approach in the amendment exercise. And today's amendment regulations will focus on the first stage. The first stage amendments include some changes. That is, to raise a standard of sanitary fitments in private buildings. There are three major components to the first stage amendments. First, introduce new categories of building users. Now, in the regulation, currently there are only 5 categories of building users, namely residential buildings, offices, industrial undertakings, and other places of work, places of public entertainment, cinemas, and restaurants. And to provide for standards for other building users, we're going to introduce additional categories of users, including sports stadia, shopping arcades and department stores, religious institutions, and funeral parlors. The second component is to enhance the standards for the provision of sanitary fitments in particular female sanitary fitments in public places. And earlier on, the Buildings Department engaged an independent consultant which conducted a survey in different public places to collect data and demand for sanitary fitments, waiting time, usage, etc. Having collected the data, the consultant has proposed new standards which will greatly enhance the provision of female sanitary fitments. In particular, for places of public entertainment, the provision will increase substantially from 75% to 160 and 185%. The third component is to rationalize a standard for restaurants. The regulation at the moment does not have any breakdown on the standards depending on the size of restaurants. And taking into account that the demand for sanitary fitments may be different depending on the size of the restaurants, we're going to rationalize the standard for restaurants so that it will align with the licensing requirements stipulated by the FEHD. Now, we consulted the panel on development on the above proposal. Members were generally supportive of the amendments, and they believe that the exercise should be carried out as soon as possible so as to enhance the standard of sanitary fitments in private buildings. And in early October, the Secretary for Development ordered publication of the amendment regulations in the Gazette, and we're now following a negative vetting process. In fact, the regulations will come into effect on the 14th of December, and we would like to, meanwhile, seek views from members on the amendment regulations, and we're happy to take questions from members. Thank you. Any questions from members? Mr. Ray Chan. And then Mr. Ma Fung Kwok. Thank you, Chairman. I have 3 questions. The first question on the change in the ratio. Now, a consultant was engaged. I'd like to know the criteria used in making the assessment. I can see that they include population, gender ratio, usage, and the use of establishment by different genders. Well, because I know that back in the 60s, over 95% of the staff was male. So for officers, the ratio was 2:1. But in some cases, the usage by female may be much higher than male, depending on the time period. We don't really need an independent consultant to tell us that, in fact, the time needed may be different between female and male. As for the use of the usage in different places, for example, in a performance venue, depending on its usage, I want to know whether we will allow any flexibility. For example, for Cantonese opera, I had this experience because 90% of the audience was female. The gents' toilet was changed to the toilet for ladies. So I want to know whether this will contravene the regulation. In submitting building plans, of course, the Buildings Department will look at the regulations. But I want to know whether there are any rules governing any change in the use of toilet by another gender. And also, I proposed the same suggestion at different occasions, that is to introduce unisex toilets. I don't know whether this will be relevant to this regulation, because this governs private buildings. But I've said this a number of times before, even to the Secretary. In Taiwan, in different places, they've already introduced unisex toilets. I won't lay out the philosophy. We're not talking about toilet for the disabled. We can't say that because there is no distinction between gender, this demand can be met, because our demand is for transgender persons or parents with children to use the toilets. Have you considered this suggestion? Deputy Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chen, for your questions. Well, I'll try to take the first question first. Mr. Chen, I'm sorry, it should be Mr. Chen. Mr. Chen mentioned the consultancy study. How did the recommendations come by? To directly understand the usage of toilets, we would agree that we should conduct on-site surveys. So the consultant dispatched staff members to different public places to look at the usage of toilets, including the number of users, the provision of facilities, the degree of satisfaction, the waiting time, etc. So it's a two-stage approach. For the first stage, we'd agree that the gender ratio may be different. For example, in cinemas, it was revealed that it's more frequent, female audience use toilets more frequently. And that is why we're adopting a ratio of 1 to 1.5 because of greater demand for ladies' toilets. So this will apply to cinemas. As for the second part, we're talking about usage time, which could also be found in the findings of the consultancy study. So, for example, in a public place, there may be 100 users of men and women, and they have different demands. Then there is a greater demand for ladies' toilets because women may need more time in using the toilet. So the findings show the sanitary fitments that should be provided for both genders. Now, let me take the third question on unisex toilets. The consultant did make a recommendation on this. According to the consultant's report, introducing unisex toilets may be difficult in terms of property management or security reasons or different sanitary or hygiene requirements by different sexes and also cultural differences. So if we introduce such a provision in the legislation, we need to provide more usable area, floor area, and we need to consult the industry's views as well. Although at this stage we're not taking the legislative route in introducing unisex toilets, in 2012 the Buildings Department, when updating the practice note, already introduce the relevant part to encourage the provision of the relevant facilities in private premises to help those who find it difficult to use ordinary toilets, so to speak.
For the second question, maybe the Deputy Director can address that. Mr. Chan asked about public places of entertainment. In some cases, can we have certain flexibility when the ratio of males and females change? Per venues of public entertainment, it's the venues differ. So we can establish different sanitary fitment standards for males and females. But in reality, if the majority of the audience are males, we can have certain flexibility, but it's hard to put this down in the law in terms of future management and operations. So would such deployments be legal? As long as the number of water closets and other facilities are not reduced, if they are merely converting a male toilet temporarily to a female toilet, then that's an acceptable temporary arrangement. Mr. Mafung Kwok, Ms. Sit Ho. Chairman, I have two questions. First of all, according to the government's paper, they mentioned places of public entertainment, including cinemas. But for places of public entertainment, well, I'm referring to cultural facilities. The government had considered cinemas. What about other facilities? Well, this is relevant to the sanitary fitment standards. Most movies last from 90 to 120 minutes. Both males and females can leave their seats and go to the toilet if necessary. But in a lot of cultural facilities, well, I'm referring to places of public entertainment. For cultural facilities, normally the organizer do not permit the audience from entering or leaving their seats. And in that case, if the audience needs to go to the toilet, then, well, we are looking at a different mode altogether. They would usually go to the toilet during the halftime break, and the break would only last for 10 to 15 minutes. And after visiting the toilet, they would return to their seats. The period is very short, and we have a lot of users during that time. So in that case, the situation is very different from cinemas or other places of public entertainment. There is a special need. I visit these cultural facilities all the time, and if I visit with my family, you can imagine that the nature's call is sometimes very urgent. So have you tried to understand the needs of these in these facilities? For West Kowloon, for example, is the ratio of 1.5 really adequate? For these facilities, I'm not sure whether the toilets would be very far from the performance venues. The audience might have to walk a long way. Even with the new regulations, their needs might still not be satisfied. So did the consultant consider this factor before proposing this ratio? So that's my first question. Second, on sports facilities. The government said new sports facilities would be introduced into the regulations. And as mentioned on the paper, the government would gradually improve existing buildings in order to satisfy the ratio. So my question is, financially permitting, how long would you spend to on the consultancy study to improve those buildings? How many buildings do not satisfy these requirements? Deputy Secretary, thank you very much for the questions. Mr. Ma mentioned government facilities and facilities in public places. The regulations mainly apply to private premises, but for government facilities, I'm happy to tell you that since a long time ago, our colleagues have tried to introduce new provisions in terms of sanitary fitment standards. As Mr. Mas mentioned, we would focus on new facilities, but we are aware that for a lot of old government facilities, when they carry out major renovation works, we would try to introduce these new standards. We have tables of figures to show that for newer facilities, for example, the Victoria Park swimming pools or the Koshan Theatre, they are already following the latest standards. And as such, the standards of sanitary fitments have been enhanced. Even for these new facilities, would the concern I raised be addressed? The standards in cultural facilities are quite different. Can you provide the relevant data? Under this regulation, we have introduced new types of buildings. Shopping malls weren't covered before. So we have to consider whether the standards of sanitary fitments at different facilities are satisfied. So as such, we introduce new types of buildings, including sports stadia. And from the consultancy study, we understand the needs for in these new types of buildings. In order to satisfy the needs for sanitary fitments at different facilities, Ms. Sid Ho and Mr. Koi Kang. When drafting this bill, how many women were involved in the drafting? I think from what the government said, they have no understanding of the needs of women. I think their knowledge of women's needs only came from biology classes. So I suggest the representatives from the government to put on women's clothes during winter time. Put on a big coat and take a handbag with you. Well, I'm not asking you to put on a bodysuit. So you can imagine how long it would take to for women to dress up. So the ratio of 1 to 1.5 is not enough. So in Hong Kong, 52% of the population are women and the rest are men. So the habits of women and men are very different. You only have to look at the cinema at IFC. So try to stay behind for a few minutes after a movie. You can look at the queue lines at women's and men's toilet. We always talk about mainstreaming of gender, but if toilets cannot reflect the gender reality, then any talks of gender mainstreaming would be useless. So I'd like to say that the ratio of 1 to 1.5 is seriously inadequate, and when you consider the habits of male and female users, this ratio is not enough, and you have to improve on that. And I was very surprised by what the Deputy Secretary said, and they said males and females have different needs for sanitary fitments. It just meant nothing. There should be fixed standards for male and female users. Males generally can tolerate lower standards. I've visited a village in northern New Territories, and there was, and the toilet was flooded, and the females have to sit down, but males don't. So the hygiene conditions were very bad. The fact is, we need clean male and female toilets that are free of germs. So can you explain why you said males and females have different tolerance levels towards hygiene? And third, I'd just like to follow up on what Mr. Ma said. If you watch a show at Kwai Ching Theatre, it's very difficult to go to the toilet. There are many rows of seats. If you need to use the toilet during the halftime break, then you have to pass by rows and rows of people before you can return to your seats after you return from the toilet. So you have to pass by a lot of other people before you can reach your seats. So, and for the ratio of 1 to 1.5, it's still inadequate, especially for cultural facilities. So please improve on that. So can the Secretary also address whether there's any gender mainstreaming when amending the regulations? Did they consult the Women's Commission? And what's the view on the male-female ratio? In the consultancy study, I'd like to talk about the methodology first. The consultancy made actual visits to the venues to look at the usage and waiting times of male and female users, and the supply of male and female sanitary facilities. So field surveys was done. So they actually looked at the actual usage of male and female users. So I'd like to elaborate on why we arrived at 1 to 1.5. And our regulation has two parts. The ratio of 1 to 1.5 reflects the usage of sanitary facilities by males and females. For cinemas, according to the consultancy study, females are generally more interested in cultural activities. So compared with men's, there are more female users. So that's why we came up with the ratio of 1 to 1.5. For a 600-seater cinema, because of this 1 to 1.5 requirement, we expect 360 females and 240 males in the cinema. So we must have enough facilities for everyone. So this is already a substantial improvement because the existing ratio is 1 to 1. So in other words, in a 600-seater cinema, there are 300 males and 300 females. So this is already an improvement. And this is because the standard has improved to 1 to 1.5. And we have to consider another factor, which is the time spent in sanitary facilities by males and females, and this is due to biological differences. So the usage times by males and female users are different. And again, our consultant has made actual visits to the venues and looked at how long males and females would spend in the toilet. So the ratio, again, is not 1-to-1. And for us, let's take a 600-seater cinema as an example.
Now, as I mentioned just now, we estimate that in a cinema with a seating capacity of 600, there will be 240 men and 360 women. And the ratio, as far as toilet usage is concerned, is not 1 to 1.5. For men's toilet, the number will remain at 5, but as for women, it will substantially increase from 3 to 7. So the study has taken into account the number of users and also the time needed for a woman to use a toilet. What about gender mainstreaming? Has this been taken into account? Have you also consulted some women's organizations, such as the Women's Commission? When we proposed this standard, we went through extensive consultation, including some women's organizations, the Women's Commission. They were generally supportive of our proposal. Madam Chair, if you want to understand a particular culture, you should try on their clothes. That is why when many people travel to Japan, they try kimonos, so that they know the way why they walk the way they do. I don't think the government officials understand the time needed because of their apparels. It's not really because of the physiological process that it takes longer for women to use a toilet. It takes much more trouble for women to sit down, to get undressed, and to get dressed. I know that as well. So if it's a ratio of 360 to 240, and if that's how you arrive at the ratio of 1 to 1.5, it's far from adequate. If you only take into account users and the usage time, then you're really far from reality. You haven't answered me. In the process, how many women took part in it? Well, Deputy Secretary, in your paper, it seems you didn't explain very clearly about this ratio of 1 to 1.5. Yes, you gave an explanation just now, but I want to know how you come by this figure. Because in winter or in summer, depending on the season you conduct the study, the result may be completely different. So can you give us something in writing and explain to us about this ratio of 1 to 1.5? And also, in your reply, you should tell us what you have taken into account in arriving at the proposed increase from 3 to 7. Now, I asked the government officials to do a number of acts. You have to take off the scarf and also your handbag and also the stockings. You need to take off the stockings, and then you sit down and then you get up again. Just these 4 moves. Mr. Kwok Wai Kang. Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, the regulations will be amended. I see that there are different standards for different premises. But I see that they involve water closets, drainage work, sanitary fitments. Will more be covered? For example, signage. Because some toilet signs are not conspicuous. They're really hidden. So my first suggestion is signage. My second suggestion is this. The government is encouraging people to make babies and breastfeeding under its new population policy. I want to know whether you're going to include the breastfeeding tables for women. Now, of course, if it's breastfeeding, it will be done by women. But if it's only for feeding of babies, it can be done in a nursing room. So have you taken this into account, the need for parents to feed their babies? Let me take the second question first. In 2009, the Buildings Department already issued a practice note encouraging private commercial buildings to install nursing rooms and encourage developers to incorporate this recommendation. And since the practice note was issued in 2009, we understand that a lot of developers have already provided such facilities, including the link REIT and also shopping malls under the link REIT and also the URA. And as far as the government is concerned, we also lead by example. Now, in new government buildings and public organizations, we've already incorporated this new requirement. We have 240 such nursing rooms. As to whether this should be incorporated into the legislation, well, we're at the first stage of a two-stage approach. And this may not be directly relevant to the amendment regulations because this stage relates to toilets. But I'll reflect your view to the relevant policy bureau. Madam Chair, the administration just now mentioned the practice note, but practice note is not sufficient. You may be delighted to see that some developers have taken on board your suggestion, but there are countless developers not heeding your advice. So I think it may be more practical to incorporate this into the legislation. And very often, such facilities would be installed inside toilets. If you suggest that it should be separated, then in the future, for private buildings, does it mean that there should be a separate room for either men or women to nurse their babies? Because you just said that this does not relate to this exercise. Where are you going to do it? I don't think breastfeeding should be carried out in toilets. But like Mr. Kwok Wai Keung said, in the toilet there should be a folding table for the changing of diapers. Some cleaning may be required in the toilet after changing diapers. So perhaps we should have such facilities in either the gents' toilet or the ladies' toilet. I'll defer to the director. Mr. Zhang. Now, like Mr. Kwok Wai Keung said, the amendment regulations are about standards of sanitary fitments such as water closets. So this is not included, but we understand that there is public aspiration and there is demand from the public for such. And that is why in the practice note we suggest that nursing rooms should be provided. And the room should not be installed in the toilet. There should be a separate room. Nursing rooms for breastfeeding, we agree that it should not be mixed with toilets. It's wrong to ask mothers to breastfeed their babies in the toilets. But what about changing diapers? If a folding table can be provided in the toilet, then the mother can change the baby's diaper there and clean the baby there. So apart from urinals, water closets, will this be covered as well? Let me supplement. The regulation doesn't stipulate every single detail. Usually, the buildings department will set out details in the practice note in relation to the design and planning of such facilities. I think this will be more appropriate because the spatial requirement and the design for different buildings may be different. So it may be difficult for all building plans to comply with the legislation. So I think it would be more appropriate to consider incorporating that in the practice note. Now what's the difference between the practice note and the regulation? For regulation, they stipulate mandatory requirements. As for other requirements, they're incorporated in the practice note issued by the buildings department. Apart from latrine basins, tables, there are also other stipulations in the practice note. But it's not contravention if the practice note is not followed. Right, so if this is only incorporated in the practice note, I don't think the majority would think that it's necessary to include a folding table in the toilets for the convenience of parents. So if you don't include this as a legal requirement, how are you going to promote that? Perhaps you should go back and think about it. I'm sorry you've spoken for too long. Please wait for your next round. Dr. Kenneth Chen. Thank you, Madam Chair. I really can't help you at all. I'm a man, but as you may know, apart from myself, my father, my grandfather, we have a lot of female in our family, daughters, sisters, etc. So every time, the waiting time is so long every time when we go out to cinemas or to restaurants. It's a really challenging issue for us. Of course, I welcome any improvement to the existing undignified, inhumane situation. And we should respect the person's privacy and the person's dignity. But very often it's hard to do. Hard to do that. Now, I'll be frank, having heard the government's explanation, I think that your approach is still outdated. In a public toilet, well, yes, the government may lead by example. There may be a place for men to change a baby's diapers. But the size is so small and it's unhygienic. It's dirty because no one cleans the table and nobody would dare to put the baby there. So even if I want to help my wife change the baby's diapers, it's really difficult for me to stand inside. So it's a really appalling situation. It's really a waste of breath to ask for people to follow the practice note. And also, well, if you think that people would follow the practice note in submitting building plans, then you should give us some figures, give us statistics for renovation or alteration works in shopping malls, how many times have you said to developers that you should include facilities? You should include separate facilities in toilets for parents' sake. And how many times have you asked people to follow the practice note? But you should understand that even if people don't follow the practice note, you won't reject the building plans. That you don't have the power. You have the obligation to remind them, but they can choose not to follow.
For the provision of washrooms in restaurants, you might be aware that in big shopping malls, they have done enough. And it's not necessary to provide washrooms in restaurants. And outside the restaurants, there would be signages directing users to the toilets, and inside the washroom, different cubicles might belong to different restaurants. So in that case, how can you deal with them? Because some restaurants might not have toilets, and as such they can dodge this requirement to provide toilets in restaurants. So this is a criticism, and this is something we haven't done. So can you provide us with solid evidence or data on whether the buildings department can play the role of gatekeeper? Thank you very much for the question. I talked about the impacts of our practice note before the legislative proposal. We have included the ratio of males and females in the practice note, and the ratio is 1 to 1.5. In 2005, we have issued a practice note with the enhanced ratio, and by 2014, 105 projects have already adopted the new standards. So we can see that the trade agrees with the principles. And with regards to toilets in restaurants, we would look at the entire premises. And in each premises, there might be 5 restaurants, so to speak, and there could be other shops. We would look at the total number of users, and an adequate amounts of sanitary facilities would be provided in the shopping mall. I don't really understand it. He said there were 105 projects, but what was the percentage? Was it 2%, 3%, or what? It could not possibly be 100% because it was a practice note instead of a legal requirement. Do we have enough room for breastfeeding? Do we have enough room for fathers to help take care of their babies, to change their diapers and so on? In reality, the answer is no. So can you elaborate on what you just said? Just the past weekend, I was in Pacific Place for dinner and movie. And there was a toilet shared by multiple restaurants, and restaurants don't have toilets of their own. So if we are to amend the regulations, do you mean that you would only look at the whole shopping mall instead of separate restaurants? In the practice note, we recognize that the ratio of male to female is very important. For restaurants, let's say we have 4 restaurants, we would look at the total number of users. For instance, if we expect 100 users in total, according to the regulation, we would provide enough sanitary facilities for 100 users. So in other words, the shopping mall is regulated, not the restaurants. You are only regulating the mall, a public space, rather than the restaurants themselves. Well, there are 2 aspects. if there are 4 restaurants in the shopping mall, we would anticipate the total number of users and designate adequate sanitary facilities. And on the other hand, restaurant has to apply for a license from FEHD, and we would review whether they have enough sanitary facilities. Well, this is rather technical, but I just want to make it straight. Restaurants have to renew their licenses every year. So would the government review all 4 restaurants together, or they would only review the applicant? Do they have to, would they vet whether they have enough sanitary facilities for the whole shopping mall? The calculations must be made separately. It must be counted separately. If there's an extra restaurant and there might be 200 extra users and we need to provide extra facilities for those 200 users. All right, one last question for me. When the amendment regulation is passed, would all future construction or rezoning projects filed to the buildings department be asked to follow the ratio of 1 to 1.5? For new projects, they have to comply with the regulation. What about for renovation projects? For major alteration, they would have to follow the standard. So what does it mean by major renovation for the general public? For example, in the South Horizons Mall, there's a strangely designed toilet. And we hope the owner would upgrade their facilities as they renovate the mall. So this is, as I said, this is something about dignity and privacy. So if you are the only one who decide whether or not the project is major or not, how would you draw the line? The practice note is not legally binding, and we can only regulate new projects. For major alteration works, we can consider them new projects. But we do have a legal framework in place. So we are back to square one. You talked about this practice note, and you said it's very effective, and you urge premises who undergo alteration works to follow the notes. But this is all empty talk. It's not legally binding. So we can only hope that the mall owners would be generous. We might have to start a petition for better toilets. I think this is something the government can really help, but then you're not doing it properly. So I don't see the reason for scrutinizing the bill. You are merely changing a few words. So let's give some time for the legal advisor to brief us more. Mr. Gary Fan. Oh, I have something to add. We want to clarify that these are principles under the buildings ordinance. Any new regulations can only be introduced in the new agenda, so it might be difficult to introduce new regulations. So please remember that these regulations only apply in new buildings and buildings that undergo major alteration or retrofitting works. Mr. Gary Fan, Mr. Wu Chi-Wai. Thank you, Chairman. Livelihood is very important, and we have great expectations on this amendment bill, and as a modern city, Hong Kong should catch up with the times because we are lagging far behind. I don't intend to repeat what others have said. For the subway system in Taiwan, they have indicator lights showing which toilets are occupied and which are vacant and which are family friendly. And they have signages to show the distance of the closest toilets. And this is much better than Hong Kong, but those were made, those were not done by the government. And they have toilets for children. Even 4 to 5 years ago, while in some new toilets built by the LCSD, I have visited the male's toilet. I'm sure they have it in women's toilets as well. What I want to say is that under the practice note for venues with 200 users or above, we should make it mandatory to install a chair in the cubicle so that infants or babies can be sat on the chair while the mother or father goes about their business. And you said due to land supply, you have to you face certain requirements for places with less than 200 users, but for those with more than 200 users, you should implement that idea. You merely have to put a chair in each cubicle. I think from these details, you can, people can see the government's determination to catch up with the times. So hopefully under the practice note, this is something which can be done. Or you can tell us whether you already consider that. Deputy Secretary, for children's toilets, as Mr. Fan said, we have received comments on introducing children's toilet, and this has actually been addressed in our consultancy study. Having considered the experience from other countries, many other countries have no legislation to make the provision of such facilities mandatory. The Buildings Department has also considered the views from users and parents, so we have introduced the relevant provisions to recommend the trade to install children-friendly facilities. But if we are to put it in the law, then we have to do some extra studies. You understand that no extra space is needed, right? The idea is to put it in the law. I think the case is same as changing diapers. So we can certainly study it further. Mr. Wu Chi-wai and Ms. Anne Leung. Chairman, I have 2 comments. We understand that this regulation applies to new buildings submitted to the Buildings Department, but for a lot of old applications, especially for small operators, they would very often turn the intended toilets into storerooms. So from the FEHD's perspective, are you aware of this situation and what have you done? And second, as Mr. Fan said, for restaurants with a lot of customers, should we assign different tiers under the regulation? For small restaurants, then they might not have to do anything, but for bigger restaurants, they have to install extra facilities to meet the user's needs. I think this is the right way to do it. Third, for big shopping malls, they often have a lot of restaurants. If I'm correct, the deputy director said the requirements would not be tallied together. The standards won't be tallied together. If there are 10 restaurants in a shopping mall, then the mall should multiply the required standard by 10. Is that the case? I visited a lot of shopping malls and I don't see separate tallying being practiced. And as Dr. Chen said, sometimes tags would be put up in toilets to indicate the restaurants.
In a large shopping mall, the shopping mall's customers, not necessarily restaurant patrons, would also need water closets. And how is this demand met? So as a result, is it that there is under provision of toilet facilities in shopping malls? Deputy Secretary. Now on larger restaurants and smaller restaurants, the third part to the amendment regulations tackle exactly the point raised by Mr. Wu. At present, we don't have separate standards for different sizes of restaurants. As a result, the standard may be too harsh for smaller restaurants. And therefore, for smaller or medium-sized restaurants, we propose different standards for the provision of sanitary fitments. For the other two questions, I'll defer to Deputy Director. Thank Mr. Wu for the two questions. First, on using shopping mall toilets for storage, the FEHD would conduct inspections to see if the facilities are maintained in an appropriate manner. The second question on the provision of sanitary fitments in shopping malls for restaurant patrons and shopping mall customers. We would look at the total number of customers or restaurant patrons in calculating the sanitary fitments to be provided. I don't know whether I understood you correctly, because you just now said that for restaurants the ratio would be calculated individually. So let's say if there are 10 restaurant A's, then the standards for restaurants should be that the number of restaurant A's be multiplied by 10. But apart from restaurants, there may be other shopping mall customers. So on the demand for toilet facilities, would the calculations still be correct? Because there is a ratio for restaurant patrons. What about shopping mall customers or passers-by? Do we have sufficient ratio for them? We do our calculations based on the size of eateries and the number of customers or number of users in the shopping mall to see if they meet the requirement in providing adequate sanitary fitments. Now, why don't you go back and give us a reply in writing, because there are more and more shopping malls with eateries, because I see that there is one there is one water closet for 120 females, but a different standard applies for restaurants and toilets and shopping malls. Let's say if in a shopping mall originally there were 4 restaurants, and then after renovation, if another unit is leased, then there would an additional toilet be required. So can you give us a written reply on how you arrive at the ratio, and whether the ratio should be calculated separately? Because I don't have this impression that the calculations are done separately, because for toilet facilities on the first floor and second floor, they remain the same regardless of whether there are restaurants on that floor. So I'd like to know how you come by the calculations, because if there are restaurants on that floor, then supposedly there should be a particular ratio for the restaurant, so there should be more. So can you give us a written reply? Just to supplement, we look at the whole development plan at the planning stage. For example, in a shopping mall, there may be 4 restaurants. So we look at the plan comprehensively. And at the second stage, the restaurants would need to apply for a restaurant license, and the FEHD will then check if adequate toilet facilities are provided. So let's say if the restaurant is on the first floor, and can they say that the sanitary fitment is provided on the second floor? Yes. So it's pointless. Whether or not there are restaurants on that floor of the shopping mall, the number of water closets may be the same. Well, I think what we see is this. You're not providing enough, and that's why I raise this issue. And secondly, of course, I understand that there are inspections, and of course they will make sure that the irregularities won't be found out. But I want to say that usually in a restaurant where there should be 2 water closets, 1 would be used for storage. Only 1 would be available for use. So in your paper, can you also explain to us how you conduct an inspection? Say there may be 4 cubicles, but only 3 may be available for use. The remaining 1 would be locked, not necessarily for storage, but maybe for staff's use only. But they're very clever. They would say that for repair. They would put up a sign and said it's for repair. Well, sometimes it's locked by staff members. However, it's counted towards the provision for the whole shopping mall. So can you give us a reply how you tackle this issue? Next, Mr. Eleanor. Thank you, Madam Chair. I do have some strong feelings about ladies' toilets. In 2004, I was elected member of this council. So I was trying to identify a livelihood issue that would not be too controversial, that would apply to both genders. So I submitted a policy paper on this issue. Now it's 2015. And finally, there'll be amendments to the building regulations that have been enacted for 50 years. So, on the face of it, we should be delighted to see amendments. But, Madam Chair, if we read para 3 and 4 of the paper, there are now 5 categories of building uses, and there will be additional categories of uses. Now, in short, 3B, 4F, namely offices, industrial undertakings, and other places of work in sports stadia, the ratio would be 1:1, whereas for other categories, the ratio would be 1:1.5. That's my understanding. About 11 or 12 years ago, I already made this suggestion. Developers are so reluctant in providing space for sanitary fitments because in a shopping mall, in a restaurant, they'd rather make way for another table or more seats to make more money. So at that time, I had a suggestion. I asked whether, in terms of land policy or plot ratio, something can be done to encourage developers to provide more toilet facilities. Well, now developers are more willing to provide for pedestrian links, lifts, and other facilities because of leases granted by the Lands Department. So something should be done about it. And also, I'd like to know whether there is a mechanism to flexibly redeploy gents toilets for women, which seem, because gents toilets seem to be in a surplus. We're talking about a smart city, and we see smart traffic lights in a shopping mall with several floors. Could we have some indicators installed to show that, for example, if you go up a floor, you don't need to wait for a toilet? And when you go to a play during intermission, can you say, do something about the gents' toilets? I mean, not for existing ones, but for new ones. At the time when you submit building plans, can we provide another entrance to some of the cubicles in the gents' toilet for women's use? It's been 50 years and things are still quite rigid. So these are my comments. And I do have a question related to the amendment regulations. The ratio will be amended from 1:1 to 1:1.5. So, for example, places of public entertainment, on page 13 of the Chinese version, that is section 7, or clause 7, amending section 6, places of public entertainment. So, table 8 and table 9, how do they reflect what's been said in the paper? The ratio in public places of places of public entertainment, that is, the ratio should be 1 to 1.5. How is that reflected in the number of water closets or urinals? So perhaps the administration would like to explain table 8 or 9 to me. 2 questions on the plot ratio.
一般嚟講
Generally speaking, in terms of statutory sanitary requirements required by the facilities, we would not compensate for the plot ratio. This is an important principle. Even though the regulation is not in the amendment regulation is not enforced yet, we have issued practice notes, and a lot of developers of shopping malls decided to do it anyway because adding new toilets might be beneficial to their business. So we should not provide any subsidies to developers for complying with statutory requirements. And the second question is the drafting of the law. And in terms of the drafting, the requirement on sanitary equipment standards have two parts. The first part is on the number of users, and this is to do with the ratio of 1 to 1.5. Since we have more female users, for every one male user, there is 1.5 female user. For users at public places and under clause 4, the figure was mentioned. So how is this reflected in Table 9? Table 9 refers to the second phase. Once we establish the number of female and male users in the cinema, let's say we have 100 males, the table stipulates the number of water closets and urinals required. These have been listed in Table 9. This is the same for female users. How many, the number of water closets required for a specific number of female users has been stated. For every 100 male, the number of urinals is less than the number of closets for 100 females, and this has reflected the biological differences between males and females. Chairman, the Deputy Secretary mentioned the two stages, but though both are connected, right? My question was, how do you link both parts together? So for simplicity's sake, we can create a new table to show the impacts of both stages merged together. So we will wait and see how those two stages are linked together. I want to respond on the issue of plot ratio. The policy is that there is a statutory requirement and it must be complied before a permit is issued. You said the developer would follow the practice note. For instance, Dr. Chen said he brought his family and his wife and daughter so on did not have to wait. But the problem is, as our female colleagues have said, you said some developers would follow the practice note, but the reality is that it's still not enough. So my question is whether we can introduce some creative thinking. Can we have more female cubicles, or can we have more flexibility so that our premises of public entertainment or sports stadia and so on, if we can introduce something that brings more convenience to female users, then it should be done. And these ideas might not be compatible with the existing policy, so have they actually considered these possibilities? this is not rocket science. A lot of female users are not satisfied. If you go to the cultural center, if you watch a drama or show, then you only have to look at the female toilet during the halftime break. So this amendment is better than nothing. But if you are only making such minor amendments after 50 years, then it's not adequate. Since you are providing the papers anyway, can you tell us whether or not you have considered any other options? And I have one more question on behalf of Ms. Ho, because she had to excuse herself. For the Hong Kong Coliseum, it's primarily used for concerts rather than sports facilities. So which table should we look at? The Hong Kong Coliseum is a government property, and it's not governed by this regulation. Well, it was just an example cited. If a venue is classified under A, but the actual use is B, then what should you do? What are you going to do? Deputy Director, if the actual use is B, a public entertainment venue, then a relevant license must be applied, and during the application we would vet whether they have to comply with other requirements. We have house rules to deal with, so I have to extend this meeting by 15 minutes maximum. Some members would have questions for the second round, and we have to give some time for legal advice as well. We still have 3 members right now, so I'd like to know whether we would invite trade bodies or the public to give their views. So yes, so let's have the Secretary set aside a date for us. Yes, we feel a public hearing is necessary, right? Yes, we have 2 choices, the 3rd and 9th of November. So let's do it on the 3rd. As the Deputy Secretary said, this is it will be dealt with by negative vetting, and amendments would be moved on the 4th of November. Can we apply for an extension from the Council so that we have more time? And after the extension, the deadline would become the 2nd of December, and if any amendments are moved, and the deadline would be the 25th of November. The clerk said the date set aside is the 3rd of November, and we would invite deputations. And after meeting the deputations, let's meet. So hopefully any papers could be provided by the government before the 3rd of November. So we might have a longer meeting that day. Do you agree with the arrangement? Around 9 to 12 in the morning. All right, so we have dealt with the House rules and with the we want to set aside the 9th of November, 9 to 10:30 a.m. We would have our 3rd meeting, and hopefully we can scrutinize the regulation. So please take notes. So right now, 2 more members wish to speak in the second round. 4 minutes each, please. And then the legal advisor would speak. Mr. Ray Chen. Thank you, Chairman. I understand that amendments are permitted for this regulation, but I have a technical question to ask. If members wish to amend the ratio of 1 to 1.5, is there any possibility that it would be reviewed? Can we have 1 to 2 or 1 to 3? I think the most controversial aspect of this regulation is the ratio of males to females. This is I think we only have to we have to use our common sense. As Ms. Ho said, you should do some observations. Have you ever seen more people waiting outside the male toilet than the female toilet? I haven't seen it before. In Singapore, I saw a longer line outside the male toilet and than the female toilet, but that's only an exception, I believe. On the improvement of the ratio of 1 to 1.5, I don't think the problems would be solved. The government said that under the a lot of private developers have followed the practice note. But so in other words, not all problems are solved. So I hope the government can provide some figures on premises opened in the last 3 years. Most of them following the ratio of 1 to 1.5 or even 1 to 2. If that is the case, the amendment regulation might not be much useful, because if a lot of people are already on 1 to 2 instead of 1 to 1, then it might be the amendment might be redundant. After the amendment regulations pass, would you impose stringent standards under the practice note? I don't even know whether 1 to 2 is adequate or realistic. So we have to wait till the results of the consultancy study are out. And I want to follow up on the unisex toilets as well. I don't think the government can deal with it this time. But I think the government should at least endorse this principle and take the lead in future buildings, or at least encourage people to do it under the practice note. According to 2012 practice note, there was a paragraph on setting up a unisex toilet. It only said there is expectation from the community for such facilities, and it said when providing these facilities, the premises use must be considered in calculating the standards for sanitary fitments for males and females in public places. It must be stated clearly that gender-neutral toilets are only provided on an arbitrary basis. And so how do you calculate the standards for males and females? Is it already encompassed under the law? Please let me finish my question. Some restaurants have toilets with unisex toilets or cubicles. So in these cases, do they only have to put up a label to say whether it's for male or female or both? Since time is limited, can the government respond to the question in the paper? But if members want to amend or improve the ratio further from 1 to 1.5 to 1 to 2, for example, would you further review the amendment regulation? The purpose of this regulation is to align the satisfaction levels for males and females. We have scientific data to back up our proposal. If members wish to see more female toilets, I hope you understand that we have always tried to strike a balance between male and female toilets for everyone. I hope you can consider that. So in other words, are you going to review it? If we are to amend the ratio, it might be legally challenging, because it might result in more female toilets than male toilets. So can you answer this question next time in detail? Can you explain why it might be legally challenging? I don't really understand this point. I'm sure members would come back with the same question next time. Dr. Kenneth Chen, 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, I'd like the administration to explain solemnly to us what you mean by saying that just now. If a member proposes an amendment, what legal obstacles there would be to the existing legislation, such that it may be perceived as a contravention to the existing legislation. Please go back and think carefully about it. Now, if the amendment regulations take effect, I understand that there is no retrospective effect, and this will only apply to existing buildings undergoing renovations on new buildings. And this is also in para 3 of your reply to the legal advisor's questions. For building plans that have been approved with renovation underway, the old ratio 1:1 would apply. Well, we follow what you say. What about buildings constructed decades ago? Because of space limitations, it may be impossible for them to follow the new ratio. Perhaps I should give you an example to try to respond to your point. Well, in Hong Kong, when shopping malls and when other buildings undergo renovation, they should know that there is space available to upgrade their facilities to meet your requirement. Because I understand in every district there are old shopping malls, and when the developer wishes to renovate the shopping mall, then can you ensure that they would follow the practice note and adopt a ratio of 1:1.5 or an even better ratio? Or perhaps you're going to say to me that, sorry, Dr. Kenneth Chan, whether you like it or not, this is what the regulation is about. Does it mean that we have no way to tackle this issue? Perhaps your paper should explain this point so that the public would not be misled. Regardless of the size of buildings or restaurants, you should explain clearly to us that this is impossible, so that we can stop imagining that this is possible. Thank you, Chair. So, can you tell us in your written reply how powerful this practice note is? Is it so powerful that you don't need to include this in the regulation itself? So explain about the use of the practice note, please. And just now, some members mentioned this point. Toilets for children. That is, in the ladies' toilet, there may be a smaller toilet bowl for children. Maybe it's also written in your practice note, and some developers follow, some don't, and some developers install these children's toilets in some shopping malls but not others. Can you tell us about this? We are looking after the needs of adult men and women, but we're neglecting the needs of children. it's very difficult as far as parents are concerned when their children are babies. They may need to change diapers for them, whereas they grow up to become children, it's again difficult for them to use adult toilets. So you should look after the needs of adults as well as children. Explain this in your written paper, written reply as well. Legal advisor would like to supplement. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to speak on a number of areas. Mr. Ray Chan asked this question. Madam Chair asked the same question as well about temporary arrangements to change the ratio of male and female toilets in a certain building. Say if a children's play, if it's a child's play, the female and male audience may be different. And just now the administration gave a reply, but I'd like them to explain more clearly in relation to the amendment regulations. Because say in cinemas or in performance venues, in Section 7, it provides that the number of urinals provided in a certain place should not be less than a certain number, so that there is a minimum number. And there is also a limit provision. The ratio in a cinema should be taken as 1 to 1.5. So if arrangements can be made to change the ratio of male to female toilets to cope with ad hoc needs, then in relation to this provision and also the provision of such facilities, and in English the use of the word provided, I'd like the administration to explain why under such circumstances the person in charge of the premises does not breach the regulation. Perhaps you can give us a written reply as well. And just now members and the chair mentioned this point in relation to eateries in shopping malls. In 7A and also in Legal Notice 191, there are stipulations on the number of water closet fitments or toilets to be provided, and there is also another amendment in relation to sanitary fitments in restaurants. So in the administration's written reply, could you please explain to members how, as far as the operation of the regulations are concerned, say there may be 3 restaurants in a shopping mall with customers, and what should be the ratio or the sanitary fitment requirement applicable to these 3 restaurants, and the relationship between the shopping mall and these restaurants. I'd like the administration to explain to members as well. And finally, the legal division sent a letter to the administration earlier on 2 major areas. On first of all, this amendment, the amendment regulations, whether the Equal Opportunities Commission has been consulted. From the administration's reply, I understand that the EOC welcomes the introduction of the regulations. I'd like the administration to explain about its understanding, because it only says that the EOC welcomes the introduction of the regulations. We'd like to know the reasons behind. And also, after raising the standards of sanitary fitments in places of public entertainment, there will not be discrimination against males. This is the advice of the Department of Justice. I'd like the administration to explain a bit further how this advice has come by and what are the justifications for arriving at this view. Yes, we will give our response in the written reply. The next meeting is scheduled for the 3rd. I hope before that papers can be provided. Thank you.